Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks, and this is the next in the series called The Sins of Silicon Valley. Today we're going to talk about Apple, the company town. So I think I'm going to start with a little history lesson, but my history lesson isn't about Apple. And my history lesson is about something called company script, or that song that you probably heard at some point called I Owe My Soul to the Company Store. And the reason that song exists and the reason it's so bleak is because back in the day, before unions and before work laws, there was the company store. And what the robber barons of the late 19th and earliest 20th century thought was a swell idea in many company towns, but especially in coal mining towns, was that they would not just own the mine, but they would own the land that the miners lived on and the town that the miners worked in, and the houses that provided shelter to the miners, and the food that the miners ate, and the doctor that treated the miners, and maybe not quite the water, but these days they would include the water. And so, you're a coal miner in 1890, or even as late as, 1920, and you're working in a dangerous, unlit, barely supported shaft that can cause you problems, and you work, you might be a child, very young, 12, 14, 16 years of age. You can die from lung cancer and coal lung from the dust because you don't have a proper mask. But as horrible as these conditions and working days are, the fact is that you can also go home, pay rent, buy your food at the company store or everything else that you needed at the company store. And the company owns all of it. You pay your rent, you get your salary, you get your food from the same people. And the thing is that, if you're the company and you own all these things and you pay these people, you also realize, hey, wait a minute, maybe I can pay my people in monopoly money, right? I mean, I'm the company, I own all these things, right? So why don't I just print my own money called company script and pay the miners? But the thing is that everybody has a bad day, right? And since I set the prices, I can put these people in debt, just like the sharecroppers who used to be slaves in the Civil War and worked the land, and instead of being slaves were debt slaves, because if you're going to work my land, I'm going to find a way to put you so far in debt that you are effectively a slave legally anyway. And now since then we've had laws that prevent you from doing this, but the point is that historically speaking, it is now considered a bad idea for a company to print its own money. Well, it used to be anyway. And certainly for a company to control the market and everything in it, right? So fast forward to 2020, and we have these remarkable devices called smartphones. I don't know if you knew this, but I actually record my podcast on a smartphone. Now, I use an Android, but I've used an iPhone before. And they're clean machines, right? An iPhone has several advantages over an Android. In technical terms, it is called the walled garden. And what that means is that Apple makes sure that it controls any software that appears on that iPhone. And Steve Jobs, one of the last great things he did before he died, and he did do great things, was take previous phone designs, which, let's face it, basically sucked. If you're old enough to remember what a phone was like before the iPhone came along, it was like sucking the internet through a straw, because you had just the number keypad on either a flip phone or a static phone. And if you wanted to use the internet, you'd have basically a text-based interface on usually a screen that was about 1 or 2 by 3 or 4 inches. If you were lucky, you might have a really expensive big phone that had a 2-inch by a 3-inch screen, and wow, weren't you fancy, because you might have some 8-bit graphic pictures that were something out of Oregon Trail, which you could play on an Apple too. And we'll get to that in a second about why Apple likes walled gardens. But the fact is that today, if you have an iPhone, Apple gets a cut of every piece of software that appears on that phone. Now, it is absolutely true that Apple is not, under any circumstances, in a position that the coal mining companies were at the turn of the 20th century, right? They did not have, people that own iPhones do not have to buy them at the Apple Store, even though Apple does have the Apple Store. And they do not have to buy them with Apple bucks and so on and so forth, right? The analogy breaks down at a certain point. But the fact of the matter is that, especially if you are a small software developer who created a mobile app, and, let's say your entire business depends on Apple, for example, Epic Games, which recently sued Apple in a class action with several other small software developers. If Apple just arbitrarily decides that it's going to take a 30% pay cut, then, if Apple decides it doesn't like the cut of your jib, you're kind of screwed. Now, there are instances of this where we all cheer. I'm sorry. I don't feel sorry for Parler or Gab or, anybody that gets deplatformed because you have fascist right-wing values. As I've said multiple times on this podcast, if you're right-wing after 1/6/2021, I don't care what you think. I just don't. Your opinion is of no value to me whatsoever. But the thing is that it's not just right-wing apps that get cut. Epic Games basically had their app cut the instant they stopped giving Apple their cut of 30% on the phone. And for those of you not familiar, they make the popular game Fortnite. And yes, you can play Fortnite on an Android phone, on a PC, or a PS4, or an Xbox. So there are many, many ways to play Fortnite. But the thing is that there should be a law that says that if you make a phone like an Apple or an Android and you control half the market for an essential service, and I think we can all consider our cell phone an essential service these days, that you don't just get to arbitrarily set up a marketplace and determine what the price is, right? In other words, Android, to its credit, makes it possible to sideload an app onto your phone. Now, Google cheats a little at this, and we'll get to that when we talk about Google. And the reason Google has a better reputation than Apple even though Apple has a fantastic reputation, is because, there is a way around the Google marketplace. It's hard. And if Google really doesn't like you, there are still things that they can do to absolutely screw you, and have and do. But it's not anywhere near the same league as Apple. And the thing is that it's all nice and good to talk about the free market, but if you've listened to this entire podcast, and if you have, I'm so sorry because of some of the crazy episodes I've done, you understand that capitalism has problems. And I'm sorry, I am no longer an unrestricted proponent of the free marketplace of ideas. Sometimes the market works, but a regulated market is required. In the case of Apple, society as a whole would benefit from taking a look at these really restrictive practices, and I'm not the only one that's doing this. The European Union is taking a look at Apple, now that we have a Democratic president again, the FTC is looking at Apple. And by the way, even under Trump, there was a lawsuit between the quote Attorney General, end quote, and I'll use that term anytime we refer to the former quote Attorney General, end quote Attorney General, was because and several states, like a ridiculous number of states, somewhere between 30 and 40, joined in on this suit. So I'm not the only one that thinks that this is a problem. But the fact is that there really isn't a law that is designed to handle this kind of a problem. The fact is that the Sherman Antitrust Act is more than 130 years old. It was designed for railroads and coal mines and, things that forced what did become an essential service, like, a coal-heated furnace or a railroad, which wasn't just, essential infrastructure for the consumer, but the government itself, to prevent people from setting the prices for everyone, which is admittedly a really bad idea and endemic to capitalism, because almost any capitalist will do this if allowed. But because of what happened with Microsoft, ergo why I started with Microsoft, all the other companies have been more clever, and they've created other things such as monopsony, the king of which is Amazon, and we'll get to them next. But, basically Apple makes the store, and they decide who gets in it. And if they don't like you, you can go pound sand. And I'm sorry, once you control 50% of the market on something that has become essential as a cell phone, you should not get to do that. And yet Apple does. Now, we can also talk about other things that Apple does that are unsavory. The biggest of which is the wink, wink, nudge, nudge relationship they have with China, where Apple, unlike Google, has decided to play along with the Great Firewall. Now, for those of you not familiar with what this is, unlike every other totalitarian regime in the world until recently, China basically didn't bow to the internet. They made the internet bow to China. And so what they did is they said that, you know what, if you're going to be in China and you're going to have internet or software service in China, or for that matter, if you're going to manufacture in China, not only do you need to have a Chinese partner, but you need to give us all your patent designs and all your software so that we can break it down and see how it works and make our own version and sell it cheaper overseas. China actually did this. China has actually destroyed several American technology companies, including some in Silicon Valley, by creating a cheaper version, by stealing their secrets, including hacking. And we could do an entire podcast episode on China and technology, but I won't, because this is about Silicon Valley, not China. But the fact is that there are many companies that do business in China, and I may actually have to do one on Oracle because they've got a special relationship with China as well. But I think Apple in particular deserves some scrutiny first because they have this positive, shining reputation, some of it justified, including their advocacy for privacy, which is legitimately a good thing, right? Apple encrypts everything on their phone, and no, they won't decrypt it for the FBI just because it's convenient for the FBI. Thank you very much. After some of the abuses of the Patriot Act in 2001, where the NSA decided it's going to snoop on everybody, and eventually Apple and Google decided, you know what, we don't like that, and so we're going to start to encrypt our phones, and made things a hell of a lot harder for the NSA. Given the fact that we've seen police abuses from the FBI and Customs and Border Patrol and murder cops, I think it's pretty reasonable to not necessarily trust the federal government with the data that we use in our day-to-day lives without a search warrant. And the thing is that China doesn't need any of that because of the Great Firewall, right? If you have a phone in China, and you have a version of Android that doesn't use Google services, if you use an Android phone, but if you have an iPhone, everything's accessible by the government, right? The great privacy advocate totally gives the keys to the store to China because they make their phones in China for very cheap with a company called Foxconn, which recently also went to India. And these Foxconn manufacturers are terrible. They have had workers strike because of the working conditions. Now, Apple says that it pays attention to these now, after there were some warehouse fires and mass riotous incidents in which people died, i.e. similar to the actual company store and the actual coal mine. Apple said that, this is terrible. We'll totally look into this. And supposedly they did in China. And of course, then Foxconn started building stores in, India, which has a corrupt fascist BJP government. They did the same thing over there. And then supposedly when COVID comes along and the people are like, they're forcing us to work they're not even freaking paying us. They're not paying us even with monopoly money. They're just not paying us at all. Then Apple's like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We're shocked. But I mean, this is a major American company that has one of the most positive reputations of all the major tech companies, in part because of its advocacy for privacy, and in part because of a slick media campaign that I think can only be comparable to maybe Coca-Cola, or the cigarette companies of the 1980s with Camel Joe, right? If you see an iPhone or an iPod ad, right, you instantly would recognize that it's Apple without even having to see the language or the Apple logo, right? The look of these ads and their ad campaigns are so ubiquitous and so extremely recognizable that an Apple product just seeing it. And an Apple ad just seeing it. And so the fact is that Apple basically gets all the positive benefits, and until very, very recently, none of the negative benefits that come with being a Dark Lord of Silicon Valley. But, no matter what they look like on the outside, on the inside, this is a company that definitely qualifies for the term Dark Lord of Silicon Valley. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!